And you also set it so that they only see the slides, not what comes. Right. Okay, what do you mean?
Well, hello again, everybody. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce our president now as our speaker for the talk which is coming on mapping medieval London. There's just one point I would like to make to this, if I may. The lights are going out. I read a map maker comments talking about London maps, and he wrote something to the effect that the idea of mapping was to provide two-dimensional order on three-dimensional chaos. And when I think about maps and think about streets, I can quite understand that remark. And of course, it's very fortunate that we have Vanessa here tonight to talk about mapping in the medieval period. And you know, I'm always conscious of that comment, and I'd be very interested to see how Vanessa approaches it this evening. So over to you for the first of your presidential addresses. Thank you, Vanessa.
Thank you, Harvey. Thank you. Well, imposing order on chaos, that's a big ask. I'm not quite sure that we'll get there today. And indeed, I have to start off with an apology, because this slide is not showing what it was supposed to show. I mean, some of you may have had this experience of setting things up that you choose an image and somehow it decides it's not going to show that image, but another part of the same page. So this is showing you part of British Library manuscript Royal something, which has a text, and below it has an image of medieval London around 1320. And that's obviously what I was intending to show you. It showed this on my own computer, but as soon as it came up here, it shows something different. So I apologize for that, and I'll just have to proceed. So my three presidential lectures are going to look at the challenges and rewards of creating historical maps of London at different periods. And for this first one, I'm going to focus on exploring medieval London and the map that the Historic Towns Trust published, which I was involved in, Caroline Barron was involved in, and several other colleagues, published in 2019. Then next year, I'll talk about how we made the map of Tudor London and the Historic Towns Trust map that was published in 2018. And then in 2026, I aim to talk about a project that I'm just getting off the ground, which is to map London on the eve of the Great Fire of 1666. Now, obviously, I don't want the lecture to sound like an extended plug for these three products or projects or publications, though I should say that they are, the medieval and the Tudor maps are available for sale afterwards at a slightly discounted price, and that Caroline Barron will be responsible for that. What I really want to look at is, or to highlight, is the different issues and sources for each period and how this affects the process of map making. Obviously, one striking shift for the research process is that from documentary and archaeological sources only, which is really the case for the Middle Ages, to a wealth of documentary, literary, pictorial, cartographic, archaeological, and architectural evidence for the 16th and even more for the 17th centuries. Obviously, another issue is that one of scale. While London in 1300 was close to its medieval zenith of population size and wealth, between then and the early 16th century, population collapsed with the Black Death and slowly recovered. And it's actually quite likely that London in 1520 was no larger than it had been in 1300. However, between 1520 and 1660, the metropolitan population quadrupled or more, and the built-up area spread widely beyond the medieval and early Tudor footprint, which itself presents new problems for the mapmaker. So, thinking about medieval London, there's plentiful documentary evidence for features, street names, and land use, as well as governance and economic activity for London at the end of the 13th century. And as we know, some traces remain, mostly underground, of some of the city's 100+ parish churches, its many religious houses, and a few private houses and public buildings. How can all this information be organised and represented on a map? And what do we learn by doing so? But of course, there is no historic map of medieval London. That is one created at the time it depicts, though there are some medieval depictions, all of them more or less stylized. The historical map of London circa 1270 to 1300 that the Historic Towns Trust published in 2019 was not, however, the first such map. Indeed, our own map was based on a smaller scale map published in 1989 in the Historic Towns Atlas volume of London from the earliest times to circa 1520, but updated and enlarged in a way that I'll explain in a moment. But even that was not the first attempt to map medieval London. As some of you will know, the London topographer and historian Marjorie Honeybourne drew a map of Norman London to accompany the publication of Frank Stenton's booklet on Norman London, published in 1934. I wasn't able to find an image of that. There was no image online, and of course, every library copy of Norman London has had the map taken out of it. So if anybody happens to have a scan of the map of Norman London, I'd be very grateful. So I've included one from another publication, which I just pulled down off the internet, and I have no idea where it came from. Unbekannt, as we know, is not known. So after Honeybourne's map of Norman London, she also drew another one of London at the time of the Peasants' Revolt to accompany Ruth Bird's study of the turbulent London of Richard II, published in 1949. And this was the map that she published to go with Ruth Bird's book was a simplified version of the map of London under Richard II, of which that's an extract, published separately by the London Topographical Society in 1960. And as you can see from this, this is an outline map. It shows major streets, watercourses, built features, as much detail in the way of names and ward boundaries as was feasible. It was quite large scale, about 16 inches to the mile, but it wasn't cartographically accurate or reliable in scale and rectification. And it couldn't really give you a sense of the incredibly complex network of parishes, wards, streets, and buildings. But, you know, these were really helpful for orientation and overall impression. It's interesting that at about the same time that Honeybourne was doing her maps, when Eilert Ekvall published his study of street names of the City of London in 1954, which basically looks at the medieval street names, he used the map of London around 1600 that accompanied Charles Kingsford's edition of John Stow's Survey of London. This map had been compiled using the first edition Ordnance Survey 25 inches as its base, with extrapolations from a couple of 16th century maps. Ekvall admitted that this map really represents the London of circa 1600, but he said that it will, on the whole, give a good idea of the system of streets also of medieval London. I think that's a bit debatable, actually. But so Ekvall's interest was in etymology, not topography, but I do think that users of his book might have appreciated a map a bit more closely related to his text that showed the street names whose history he traced. There are other mappings. So, for example, Christopher Brooke and Gillian Keir included these outline maps in their book London 800 to 1215, The Shaping of the City, published in 1975. And Christopher Brooke was at the time working with the Historic Towns Atlas. He may have hoped that that would appear soon after after the book, though in fact it took another 14 years to appear. So when I myself began to research on the topography of the port of medieval London for my PhD thesis in the 1970s, this was what was available. And if you were really seeking to place medieval features, streets and so on a real world map, and this was, as you recall, a very exciting time for the archaeology of the waterfront, it really wasn't very satisfactory. So the map of London circa 1270, published in 1989 in the Atlas, was a real step forward. It was really the first attempt to map medieval London at a large scale and in detail using a surveyed base. The editor and overall director of the Atlas was the historian Mary Lavelle, one-time editor of the Oxfordshire VCH. The maps were drawn by Colonel Henry Johns, later of the Ordnance Survey, and founder of the cartographic firm Lovell Johns. Christopher Brooke and Caroline Barron wrote essays on the topographical development of early and later medieval to early Tudor London. And Caroline was, I think, the main contributor of historical knowledge and topographical information to these maps. In his introduction to the maps, Colonel John set out clearly how he'd done it, his main sources, and described his mapping principles and practice. He'd used two large-scale maps of the 17th century, that is Leake's survey of the city immediately after the fire, and Ogilvy and Morgan's map of 1676. So he used both of these to plot the pre-fire street outlines on a 19th century Ordnance Survey base. Though they were based on contemporary on-the-ground surveys, neither Leake's nor Ogilvy and Morgan's maps conformed to modern standards, largely owing to the lack of accurate orientation. Colonel John sternly noted their errors and inaccuracies. But together they allowed him to create an outline of map of the city streets before the fire, and with further emendation of the early Tudor street layout for the main 1 to 2,500 map of London circa 1520 in the Atlas. And this is laying it out as we're joining up all the pages. So with this as his new base, he added major features of the early 16th century, such as the layout of the monasteries and friaries and the footprints of the medieval churches and other buildings. And these reconstructions drew on a wealth of published archaeological and historical research and some new investigations. And I think the result was an impressive achievement. Of course, there were some errors, there were some mistaken assumptions, as users were not slow to point out, but the Atlas map of Tudor London remained a valuable and much used source for many years. In the same volume, the map of London circa 1270, the map of London circa 1270 was a rather different animal. It wasn't a wholesale reconstruction as the map of 1520 had been, so you could say it was somewhat secondary rather than primary. What Colonel John, as he explained, to enable a comparative study to be made with the changing urban landscape of London, we've used the map of circa 1520 on which to show the principal ground features of the late 13th century. So the medieval map was presented at a smaller scale, 1 to 5,000, with the outline of streets and buildings circa 1520 as a faded background. I hope you can see the sort of the pale pink background of this on which the medieval features have been overlaid. So medieval streets and street names were shown, medieval churches and religious houses extant at that date, which of course means no Charter House, no St Mary Graces. Mount Fitchett's and the first Baynard's Castle were plotted. The Tower complex was shown before its Edwardian development. The line of the waterfront was shown several meters back from its 16th century extent, though in many places this can only have been speculative. As well as its maps of Roman, medieval and early Tudor London, the Atlas included two really useful maps, really useful subsidiaries, which were maps of London parishes and London wards, again at the smaller scale of 1 to 5,000. Now obviously it might have been helpful to show these boundaries on the main maps, but it would have made for a much more cluttered appearance. So I think that giving them as separate maps on the 1520 base was probably the best solution at the time. And I've certainly made a great deal of use of these parish maps as a way of getting to know where parishes and to a lesser extent wards were in medieval London. I was interested to note, and I thank John Schofield for this information, that at about the same time that the Historic Towns Atlas was taking this approach to mapping medieval and Tudor London, others were also seeking a reasonably reliable base map for localizing and contextualizing data from pre-fire London. So the Department of Urban Archaeology created an outline street map, shown here, based on those in Henry Harben's invaluable Dictionary of London, which was based on his work on Stowe, which presents, as it were, an emendation of 19th century maps by 16th to 18th century streets. And as far as I know, the DUA's street outline map here was first used in Schofield and Dyson, Archaeology of the City of London, published in 1980, and then again in John's 1987 publication, of the early 17th century property plans of Ralph Treswell. Further iterations and variants were used in subsequent publications, including the London Topographical Society's publication of Hugh Alley's account of the markets of London in 1598, in which Caroline Barron, Ian Archer, and I were involved. So this is where we were perhaps by the 1990s. Once the atlas itself went out of print before 2000, prices for second-hand copies soared. And indeed, I couldn't find any copies on Aid Books or Amazon when I looked just now. So in 2013, Old House Books used the Tudor map pages of the atlas to create the first folding map of early Tudor London for the Historic Towns Atlas, stitching together the separate pages of the atlas into a single sheet. They didn't revise the map content, but the scale was somewhat reduced, and the gazetteer printed on the back was taken straight from the gazetteer in the atlas, but rekeyed to the new map. So that was a very useful and much used publication, but by the time it was being published, it was at least 20 years out of date. So when this itself went out of print, the Historic Towns Trust decided to thoroughly revise, redesign, and reissue the folding map of early Tudor London under its own imprint. And I will be talking much more about that map and the process of creating it, the revision that went into it next time. But I think the key point here is that the success, both technically and in popularity, of the new early Tudor map prompted us to undertake, this is the whole Tudor map with the cover of the first edition. This seemed to go down extremely well, and it prompted us to consider revising and publishing the map of medieval London around 1270 to 1300, which is what I'm going to be focusing on now. And creating this map was really quite a challenge. Obviously, we already had a lot to work with, but the medieval map had never been published as a standalone map, and the original from which we were working was half the scale of the Tudor map, and not, as I've said, a fully independent entity. Both the cartography, undertaken by Giles Darks, the cartographic editor to the Historic Towns Trust, as the Historic Towns Atlas had become, and the review and scrutiny of information to be shown were very demanding, time-consuming tasks. But some of the principles and practices had already been established when revising the Tudor map: georectification and rescaling to 1 to 2,500, the replacement of property outlines with shading for the built-up area, the use of colour, symbols, and typefaces, the creation of a street directory keyed to the new map, and the use of the reverse of the map to add pictures, text boxes, and other data. And these entailed wholesale changes to the appearance of the map. But we also did revise some of the content. In the first instance, though, the street outlines on the new medieval map are essentially the same as those in the new map of Tudor London, which were based on those in the Atlas for circa 1520, with some local revisions. Because as far as we can tell, all the major streets and many of the minor ones that were there in 1520 had been established before 1300. London's population was at its medieval height around 1300 to 1320, and the street frontages were likely to have been as densely built up by 1300 as they were in 1520. Very minor streets and alleys may have changed, however, especially after the population decline following the mid-14th century plague epidemics, which led to the dereliction and abandonment of some properties. As with the Tudor map, we focused our revision on key sites and features where there had been significant advances in knowledge since the creation and publication of the Atlas. Notably, this included the religious houses, for which we had the help of Nick Holder. The revised Tudor map had extended the geographical coverage beyond the limits of the Atlas to include the northern suburb and Southwark, and this medieval map did the same. So we were having to map areas that hadn't been covered before. And we also added on an inset Westminster and Lambeth. For Southwark, we relied on the thesis and the further research of Martha Carlin, for Westminster and Lambeth on the work of Tim Tatton Brown, but many other colleagues contributed valuable information, sometimes just one point, sometimes on several. One departure from the atlas was the date we chose to represent on the map. The original map stated that it showed London in circa 1270, but the revised map takes a somewhat more elastic view of the date and says that it shows London in the late 13th century. The reason for this extension was partly to do with events and partly with sources, and also because it made sense to show London at the peak of its medieval size and importance, which was more like 1300 than 1270. A number of building works and other developments were in progress in the late 13th century. Edward I imposed several changes on London, both his own works at the Tower and in the pressure to clear the city's streets and create discrete marketplaces, such as the Stocks Market. Work on St. Paul's Cathedral and Westminster Abbey was ongoing. While the major friaries had been established before 1270, the Blackfriars moved from Holborn to their riverside site in around 1280 and subsequently extended the precinct there, while the House of Poor Clares or Minaresses was founded outside Aldgate in the 1290s, and all of these were developments we were keen to show. In terms of sources, as I'll be saying in a moment, while the inception of civic documentation dates largely from the mid-13th century, it increased hugely in quantity and coverage in the last decades of the 13th century and provides an invaluable resource for street, parish, and property names. It's complemented by government sources such as the Judicial Heir of 1272 and the 100 Rolls of 1274 and 1279. So there's quite a lot more to draw on if we're showing London up to 1300. That 30-year difference is quite significant. Perhaps we ought to have called the map London in the reign of Edward I, 1272 to 1307, which I think does really express the reality, but that's a bit cumbersome for everyday use. So the origins and history of the map are only one aspect of the story. How is it that we're able to make a map at all of London more than 7 centuries ago, let alone a detailed and, we hope, reliable map? If you look around the modern city, there appears to be little there to recall that lost city. While on closer inspection, that's not altogether true, it's still a big stretch of the imagination. But it can be done. And in this second part of the lecture, I'll discuss the sources that help us to identify, name, and locate specific features in London around 1300. Now, I'm a documentary historian, not an archaeologist, so I will be focusing on some of the documentary sources that I know best. But obviously, archaeology has a very important role to play, especially in identifying the location or the layout of particular sites and buildings. The archival record of medieval London is very rich indeed. Time and events have thinned it, but it is still voluminous and informative. A central element of record keeping is governance and administration, but the records of property holding and land transfer probably constitute the largest single category, as well as the oldest of all pre-modern documentation. Most of the earliest written documents that we have are charters concerning grants of land or property, carefully preserved for posterity because of the real value that they embodied. Not all early land transfers were recorded in writing, but it became increasingly common to do so, and certainly by the middle of the 13th century. When land changed hands, the transfer of the written evidence came to be an essential element of the transaction. Over time, more and more London land passed from private hands into the possession of institutions, such as the Bridge House of the City of London, or the church, or later the London livery companies, colleges, and schools, often in the latter cases to secure spiritual benefits. And those institutions took in, archived, preserved, organized, and in some cases transcribed the title deeds for their properties. By the later Middle Ages, they were also generating a large amount of documentation for property management, but it's the deeds in particular that are significant for this early period. And the archives of these enduring institutions, wherever they may be held now, are a treasure trove of information. Real estate in towns and cities was valuable from an early date and usually held on terms that made it more easily transferable than the feudal tenures more common in the countryside. Towns and cities also recognized the importance of the land market and certainty of tenure to their citizens, and they established courts and procedures to facilitate and guarantee such transactions. London's Court of Husting, which actually dates from before the conquest, was by the later 13th century the key forum for registering land transactions, including wills concerning real property, and for litigating claims to do with the ownership and use of property, questions of title, distraint for unpaid rent, failure to pay rent, widows' rights, and so on. Leasehold agreements between private individuals were also acknowledged in the Husting, and some records of these survive in two collections from the late 13th, early 14th centuries, now known as letter books A and B. And alongside the Court of Husting were other courts or assizes dealing with dispossession, building standards, and nuisance or damage to property. So an enormous amount of activity, this very lively land market, was in full flow by 1300, when London was populous, prosperous, and land was highly valued. Literally thousands of deeds and wills were enrolled in the city's Court of Husting between around 1250 and 1350. Thousands of original or transcribed deeds survive in the archives of the church, the guilds, and the city itself. Much land that was held by the church as an institution came into the hands of the crown with the dissolution of the monasteries, together with the deeds, registers, and cartularies that documented it. Although the crown very rapidly sold off most of the land that it had taken possession of, a huge quantity of deeds and some of the other manuscripts remained in the public domain, now in the National Archives. At the same time, the city's rich administrative records go back to the late 13th century, and royal heirs, inquisitions, and inquiries of the period yield valuable information. And the key point about all these registers of property are that they yield, obviously, the names of parties to transaction, but also much of value to the mapping process. Locational markers such as street or parish names, references to landmark features such as churches, markets, and civic buildings, and insights into the interlocking matrix of property rights in the medieval city. Early deeds from sort of mid to later 13th century often give plot dimensions. Later ones more often list neighbours and abutments, and almost always mention the parish in which the property lay. Litigation and other legal proceedings concerning property may not give the kind of detail found in title deeds, but will usually name the street or parish to identify the house or plot in question. So there's an enormous amount to draw on in the manuscripts, but we should also acknowledge the invaluable work of archivists and librarians over the years, cataloguing, calendaring, and editing many of these early sources, and the legion of historians and researchers whose publications answered many of our questions. So I'm going to look first at streets and street names. And as I said a few minutes ago, if you look around the modern city, there appears to be little there to recall the lost medieval city, but that's not altogether true. And in fact, you could immediately orient yourself in medieval London from present-day street names and alignments. Most of the streets and most of the street names in use today date from 1300 or earlier. Some of the forms have changed. What we call Cheapside was once known as West Cheap to balance East Cheap, which still exists. But if you stand at the east end of Poultry, as I was doing when I took that photograph, and look west along Cheapside, the pattern of streets branching left and right is almost the same now as it was in 1300. And I'm not quite sure how well this is going to work. It was fine on my computer, but it may not work otherwise. It's overlaying maps of different periods. That hasn't come out very well. No, I'm sorry. This was it worked beautifully when I did it before. Basically, let me go back a little bit and just, it basically overlays these two maps on one another, and you can see how closely they match. I hope that you can appreciate that at this moment. So standing, as I say, at the east end of Cheapside, or more or less outside the Mansion House, if you look along Cheapside, Poultry and Cheapside, many of the streets are still the same. So Bucklersbury, Bow Lane, Bread Street, Friday Street on the south side, Old Jewry, Ironmonger Lane, St Lawrence Lane, Honey Lane, Milk Street, Wood Street and Gutter Lane on the north all existed well before 1300, and most had recognisably the same names. Only today's Bow Lane has really changed, being known as Corvaser Street or Cordwainer Street around 1300, though it might also have been called something like Bow Lane at this time. The bow in Bow Lane comes from the church of St Mary le Bow, so known in its Latin form ad arcum or de arcibus, probably from the stone vaulting or arches on which it stood, from at least the 11th century. The major difference in the prospect of Cheapside is King Street or Queen Street, which were cut through after the fire, partly on the line of the lost Soper Lane. I should have asked for a pointer and then I could have put this out. So Soper Lane, the line of King Street, Queen Street is down there. With the wealth of property records available for the late 13th century, it was comparatively straightforward, if laborious and painstaking, to establish the then current forms of place names. So for the ones just listed, we used early versions of the names Poultry and West Cheap, Bucklersbury, Bread Street, Friday Street, Ironmonger Lane, Honey Lane, Milk Street, Wood Street, and Goodrun Lane, the Gutter Lane. As noted, today's Bow Lane was known as Corvaser Street, the street of the Cordwainers. Some were a little more complicated to determine what we should call them. So today's Old Jewry, although it takes its name from the Jewish community located there till their expulsion in 1291, seems to be known around 1300 as Colechurch Street, from the parish church on the corner of Cheapside. It was definitely called Colechurch Street or Colechurch Lane in the 1270s, 1280s, 1290s, while Old Jewry for the street itself, rather than the general area, first occurs in the 1320s. In other cases where several variant or alternative names seem to have existed in 1300, we've chosen the one that endured. The case of St Lawrence Lane illustrates a different problem. Latin was the language of administration and authority, and of deeds and legal proceedings, and a number of street names are only recorded in a Latin form, in this case, Venella Sancti Laurentii de Judaismo. I think we can assume that in ordinary speech, Londoners called it by an English version of that, but no such form is recorded. So in these cases, we've labelled the street with a modern English form, St Lawrence Lane in Jewry. Elsewhere, we just had to make a decision between Latin and English, as with the feature that we've labelled the Shambles. The street is referred to in contemporary documents as Vicus Regius versus Newgate ubi carnifices vendunt carne suis. I'm quite sure that people didn't use that in everyday conversation. But we know that the vernacular name or word Shambles was in use because the church of St. Nicholas there was surnamed at the Flesh Shambles by 1305. The streets of the Saxon grid were well established by the conquest, and once they acquired a name, it tended to stick, with a few exceptions. The names of the lanes leading from Thames Street down to the river seem to have been more changeable, perhaps because these were comparatively new emergences in the 13th century, as land south of Thames Street was reclaimed and the river frontage pushed southward. Historic public access points to the waterfront, such as Queenhithe, Dowgate, St Botolph's Wharf and Billingsgate, acquired and held their names early, but the names given to many of the smaller streets changed in the 13th and 14th centuries before becoming fixed in the 15th or 16th. So Fatty's Lane on the left in the Vintry, named from the 13th century Stephen Le Grasse, was also known as Anchor Lane, but by 1400 as Cressingham Lane from a local family, and subsequently disappeared under the Vintners Hall complex. Further east, Sayers Lane, marked here, became Armenters Lane and then Western Lane in the later 14th century, also from local families, and then Cold Harbour Lane from the adjacent property from the 15th. Most of these names and lanes have disappeared completely with the development of the waterfront, however. As I said, Fattis or Cressingham Lane was taken into the site of Vintners Hall in the 15th or 16th century, while Cold Harbour Lane, or Cold Harbour, was still so known in the 17th century, but it was taken over by Calvert's Brewery in the 18th. The church had a major presence in the map of medieval London, in the numerous parish church buildings, the religious houses, and of course St Paul's Cathedral and Westminster Abbey. Placing and naming the parish churches, which are shown there, the small reddish oblongs across the map, was also something that was facilitated by the wealth of documentary sources and by real continuities over time. All of the 100-odd medieval parish churches were established by 1300, in many cases before 1200, and all but one or two on the sites they occupied up to the fire of 1666. It's interesting that although London lost a third to a half of its population in the Black Death and subsequent epidemics of the 14th century, and still struggled to recover its numbers before the 16th, it retained almost all its early medieval parish churches and parishes through to the Reformation. And in this, it was unlike other great medieval cities with a plethora of early churches, such as Winchester, Norwich, or York, which all lost numerous churches whose locations and parish boundaries may now be impossible to recover. One tiny London church did close. The parish of St Augustine Pappy, with allegedly only 10 inhabitants, was absorbed into the parish of All Hallows on the Wall in 1442, and the church building became the home of a fraternity of priests. But otherwise, the list of parish church entities in 1300 is the same as that in 1520. However, some dedications and many surnames or denominators necessary to distinguish churches with the same dedication changed over time. The Church of St Werburger of 1300, nearest to me, had become St John the Evangelist by 1356. The church islanded in Fenchurch Street honoured St Mary in 1300, but had transferred its allegiance to St Gabriel by 1520. Several churches had one-word denominations in the 12th or 13th centuries, such as Older Mary Church, New Church, Seaman's Church, Bearman's Church, the latter meaning the Porter's Church and signifying the Church of St Martin in the Vintry. But these names either disappeared or, like Woolchurch and Coalchurch, were adopted as surnames following a dedication. Several other surnames changed. So All Hallows at the Hay or at the Hay Wharf became All Hallows the Great. Its neighbour, All Hallows on the Cellars or in the Ropery, became All Hallows the Less. St Mildred on Walbrook became St Mildred Poultry, perhaps after the Walbrook itself disappeared underground. St Michael in Candlewick Street became St Michael Crooked Lane. And in most cases, it's not obvious why the name should have changed, though St Lawrence in Candlewick Street clearly acquired the surname Pulteney or Pountney from Sir John Pulteney, 14th century benefactor, while St Andrew Cornhill adopted the more distinctive name of St Andrew Undershaft after the maypole erected nearby. The parish churches remained largely on their first foundations, St Stephen Walbrook, circled in blue in the middle, being a notable exception. Plans and layouts may have changed over time, especially in the flurry of church rebuilding and enlargement in the later Middle Ages, when many of them gained new aisles, towers, or extensions. Sometimes we were able to plot the form of the earlier medieval church, though it's worth noting that at 1 to 2,500, even a substantial extension would only be a few millimeters on the map. So in many cases for this map, we resorted to the time-honoured cartographic convention of the dashed or dotted line to show that the location, but not the exact footprint of the church, was known or could be shown. So, for example, we know that from excavations that the Church of St Pancras Soper Lane had an apsidal east end, and that this was later absorbed into or overlain by a later church building that filled the whole quadrilateral site, but we couldn't show that with any certainty at this scale. As with the map of Tudor London, the medieval map shows parish boundaries as well as parish churches on the face of the map. And these boundaries were very real to medieval Londoners, identifying and circumscribing the community owing allegiance and tithe to a particular church. So I'm really pleased that we were able, thanks I think to Giles's excellent cartography, to show them quite clearly on the face of the map. Parish boundaries are frequently cited in property deeds as a means of locating the plot in question. Again, they've largely been established by 1300, though there may have been minor alterations in the densely built up centre from time to time. And many of you will be familiar with the 19th century parish boundary marks that are dotted across the city and also found in collections of various kinds, more or less, not invariably, in the right spot. The boundaries, the city centre ones were pretty stable, but the boundaries of the larger suburban parishes, which at this time would have run, at least in part, across open ground, were probably not so clearly defined at this time. By the time they're shown on the 17th century maps, they follow property divisions and boundaries that may have been comparatively recent, so that on the map of medieval London, we show some suburban parish boundaries with a broken line to reflect this uncertainty. There would be a lot to say about the religious houses, St. Paul's Cathedral, Westminster Abbey, Lambeth. I'm not going to do that, and partly for reasons of time, but also because that's not really my work. It's Nick Holder's and other people's. So in that case, we acknowledge and borrow from, but I don't feel that I put much original research into that. So we're very grateful for those people who have worked on those topics and have allowed us to use their data. Now, since I've been saying that so much of the information used on the map comes from the documentation of property ownership, why didn't we seek to map individual properties? The answers are practicability and communicability. It could be done, at least for parts of the city, but it would take years, and it could not effectively be represented on our map, even at the large scale of 1 to 2,500. So the social economic study of medieval London, on which I worked with Derek Keane in the early 80s, took 4 years to reconstruct the property histories of 5 parishes in Cheapside. I mean, I should say we were doing a lot of other things at the same time, but even so, it's a very long and laborious process. Some of the work we did then, surveying the sources for property holding, will have enabled others to move faster, but it is still a very long process. And also worth saying is that at that time we were working at the very much larger scale of 1 to 527, using the ward maps drawn up in the mid-19th century as our base. So for this map, as you can see, we use shading to indicate the built-up frontages, which are either documented or can reasonably be assumed. But for the most part, we have avoided giving building outlines. And the fuzziness is intentional, to avoid the spurious impression of certainty, or the impression of spurious certainty. Likewise, the apparently blank areas behind the street frontages shown on the map shouldn't be taken as empty spaces. The street frontages were pierced by alleyways, allowing access to the rear of buildings, behind which there would have been yards, gardens, outhouses, animal pens, stables, workshops, privies and cesspits, and other structures or spaces that form part of the built-up city. We did aim, though, to identify and locate major structures with a public use or significance, such as the inns or headquarters of the many ecclesiastics who found it worthwhile to maintain a London base. Over 70 medieval religious houses and bishoprics owned real estate in the medieval city in Southwark, either for rent income or to house representatives on visits to the capital, or a combination of both. So we've marked a number of inns and residences. Interestingly, over time, it appears that the attraction of Westminster drew several of them into the western suburb, leaving behind only rented property ownership within the city. There are also some non-ecclesiastical inns and halls landmark features in one way or another. They're often identifiable not so much from their own archive or documentation as from positional references in other sources. One major difference that we'll see when it comes to looking at the Tudor map is the proliferation in the later Middle Ages of halls and guild halls belonging to the city's livery companies. A number of guilds existed in 1300, some with formal recognition. So the Weavers' Charter dates from 1155, but it's really only in the late 14th and 14th to 16th centuries that a great number of them sought incorporation and the acquisition of property to house their activities. The map also marks a number of commercial buildings known as cells, a feature of the period around 1300, when market activity was vigorous and demand for selling space was high. Cells resembled covered markets or malls containing stalls or plots owned or rented by independent traders, as the sketch map of St. Martin's Cell on the left indicates. They generally occupied the whole area of a recognizable burgage plot form, long and narrow, behind a valuable street frontage. Some of them acquired individual names, such as the broken cell or the painted cell. Tanner's cell identified the goods or traders to be found there. We know most about those in the stretch of Eastern Cheapside that was covered by the social economic study, but undoubtedly there were more along that street and possibly in other major trading streets too. The economic and demographic collapse caused by the Black Death, however, undermined the function of both cells and the tiny shops that lined the Cheapside frontage in 1300, so that even by 1400, most had disappeared. Some of the cell names remained as property names, but the plots had evolved into the more standard layouts of shop, warehouse, and dwelling. So in conclusion, I hope I've demonstrated how it is that we can map London at the end of the 13th century and explored some of the issues that arise: sources, language, scale, cartographic conventions, and the changes between this period and the early Tudor one. But after all that, who is the map of medieval London for? Obviously, it's for people like Lammas members who are interested in London's past, particularly in its material past, and who want to understand what the medieval city was like and how it relates to the city of today. I think and hope that it's helping school, undergraduate, and graduate students with specific projects and inquiries into medieval London. I was also intrigued to see from several reviews on Amazon, for example, that it chimes with the big interest in historical fiction and in the increasing number of novels or even series set in medieval as well as Tudor and Stuart London. Though I was slightly off put when I looked up and found a 1-star review. I thought, goodness me, what's wrong here? And that was just somebody who was complaining that the Amazon listing didn't tell you how big the map itself was. It only told you how big the folding book was. So anyway, no problem with the map itself, just with the information. But the map has also become much more widely known through the website Layers of London, which some of you will be familiar with, in which it is literally layered, geo-rectified and placed on the series of maps that website shows and that are used in all sorts of different ways. Our map is also linked through to from the project Medieval Londoners, based at Fordham University in New York, and it helps to ground their database of medieval Londoners, an enormous and growing quantity of information about medieval London. And most recently, it was showcased in the murder map of medieval London, which some of you will have seen, which locates and then analyzes the details of murders in early 14th century London, reported in the contemporary coroner's rolls. And I should say that the launch of this website had an impact far beyond what we might normally expect to reach. So I would just conclude by saying, this is where we are now. This is now, in a sense, over to you to make use of this map and to take it further, as I hope you will. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. We're gonna, you can see if there's any questions. And we'll also ask if there's any, if you don't mind answering.
Absolutely. No?
Shall I start from the floor? Right. Has anyone any questions they'd like to ask Vanessa on any aspect of the talk that she's just given to us? Please, yes?
Just very short.
Yeah.
St Stephen's Warbrook moved. Where did it move from?
Just the other side of the wall.
Oh, yeah.
So it's only a few, not even hundreds of yards, I would say. And it happens in the middle of the 15th century for, I think, a variety of very specific reasons. As far as I know, it's the only such church that moves in that way.
That's excellent. But I remember seeing it propped up when they were building the new Bloomberg on
Right.
Market Street. I
Yes.
thought, oh, they're very keen to keep it in the same place. It's fascinating to know that in a previous
Yes. But of course, the one that they're working on, the one that they're propping up, as you say, I mean, that's the post-fire
Of
one.
course, yes.
But that is on the site of the previous one, though it's not the same footprint, because, I mean, that's a very complicated shape, isn't it?
Yeah,
Whereas it's fairly standard oblong before that.
Any other questions? For